I want to say thank you to B-Sides Vancouver for allowing me to speak again. I really appreciate it. I love talking about stuff like this, and this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. This talk is really important to me from the perspective of what I do as an incident responder. So really excited to be presenting this for the first time at B-Sides Vancouver for this year. A little bit about me, for those of you who have not met me. My name is Shelly Giesbrecht. I am an incident responder at CrowdStrike. Specifically, I am the practice lead for Canada. So I run the Canadian team as well as doing some of our other global projects. And I've been doing this for a while. I started out doing help desk many, many years ago, learning how to support folks at that level. And I love Lego. And that's important because I think that from the perspective of incident response, Lego shows us how to build things and put pretty things together with a manual. Incident response is like if somebody has taken all those pieces, broken them in, and says, build it again, but do it without the manual. So we help businesses put their Lego back together, if you will. And sometimes we have a couple pieces left over, but that I think is my best job. And I love talking to clients. That's what I do. That's one of the reasons that I work in incident response, because I like to be customer facing and help folks at their worst business days. As you can tell, I love a bow tie and I'm a proud dog mama, which hopefully we'll bring in a little bit later. Today is about talking about our worst nightmare in incident response. So for your organization, what your worst nightmare is. And the reason this talk is really important to me is because I talk to a lot of clients. Every year, I talk to several hundred clients about the things that are going on in their environment, hopefully from a proactive side, but a lot of times it's that after the incident, we go in and we help, we try to figure out what's gone on. And all sorts of industries, big and small companies. But one of the most disappointing aspects of my work is not being able to meet customer objectives in their investigation. And that largely is in part due to missing evidence, things that they just don't have. And there's a few different reasons for why that might happen. When we're dealing with ransomware, for instance, that can be because the stuff has been damaged, or perhaps it's been overwritten or taken, deleted by the threat actor. All of those things happen, absolutely. But the biggest reason why we can't meet customer objectives, generally speaking, when we're talking about missing evidence, is because it doesn't exist. They don't have it. They don't collect it, and that can be a real problem when we're trying to meet those objectives. So today we're going to talk about, what's the worst nightmare? What does that look like? And then we're going to say, starting from the bottom. And that doesn't mean, we're going to, I took it from the Drake song. So there we go. But what it really means is we might find ourselves in an incident. And what I'm suggesting is we start there and we move backwards and figure out what we needed. And that is really based on what sort of organization that you are. So thing you're going to hear a lot today is it depends, because in incident response and digital forensics, that's our general answer to most questions is when we get asked, it depends. And last but not least, we're going to talk a little bit about finding your allies. How do you, once you figured out what you need, how do you get those things, and where do you find those allies to help you do that? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit briefly. All right. How do we begin? Let's say it's Friday, might be 4 o'clock, DFIR Friday, as we like to call it. You've been breached. You've had data stolen, perhaps, and you don't know what was taken. Maybe you got a ransom note that said, we're going to publish your data in 3 days if you don't pay us. Or you got a notification from a government agency, from a police law enforcement organization. Maybe I've heard of, oh, by the way, I saw your data being advertised on such and such a dark web forum. You might want to do something about that. The other option is maybe you got ransomed, you're hard down, your systems are encrypted, you don't know how to recover. So those are those worst nightmare scenarios. And by the way, the spider on the agenda slide, that's my worst nightmare. So I like to include those. Spiders, absolutely my worst nightmare. But these situations we get into as organizations, we need to understand what your worst nightmare is. And so that's kind of what I want you to do as we're going along today is think about what for your organization would be the worst incident that could happen. There are a lot of incidents that could happen. We can't prepare entirely for every single one of them, but if we prepare for the worst case scenario, we may then be able to be much more effective in other scenarios as well. Okay. So, the first thing that I'm going to ask as an instant responder, well, there's a few other questions I'm going to ask, but one of the first things I'm going to ask as an instant responder when I come in is, do you have any logs? Do you have anything that we can look at? Um, do you have PCAP? Do you have NetFlow? Do you have EDR data? Do you have web logs? What do you have that'll help us out to help you answer the questions that you need to answer? And there are some other real questions, obviously, that we're going to ask. And I love this comic. I'm going to come ask a series of scary questions. And when I'm done, let's see if you can guess why I'm asking them. All right. One of those big questions is, what are your objectives? And that's a really big one. And that's something that we help customers with. On a daily basis, I say, what I'm hearing is your objectives might be this. And I try to help shape those. But a lot of times those objectives tend to be things like, what was taken? How did they get in? Are they still here? All of those things, right? But some of the questions, that's a really important one. And then some of those additional questions that I'm going to ask are, in your organization, is there protected information? PHI, PCI, PFI, regular old PII. Is there something that we need to be concerned about that may have left your organization, that may need to be protected, that may need to have notifications made, right? What notifications would need to happen based on the information that you have? Do you know that as an organization? And what sort of obligations do you have, not only for those notifications, but what sort of contractual obligations do you have? For instance, if you're hard down and you have product to ship, do you know what those obligations are? And then what are your most critical assets? If you're hard down, your most critical assets are probably the ones that need to come up first. Do you know what priority that is? Do you know where those sit? Do you know who the owners of those data are? All of those things. And how long can you be down? So some organizations can be down for days at a time because having internet access or having systems down maybe isn't the core of their business. For other businesses, if they're down for even hours, that can be millions of dollars lost. So it really depends, and it's something that your organization needs to know. Again, it depends. So the answers really, again, are varied and different. I love Office Space. It really depends on who you are, what industry, what your actual business is, what your business model is. Again, do you need the internet for work? Could be down for days and it doesn't really matter to you. May need to be up right away. What are your local, provincial, federal laws that are applicable to your organization? What organizations do you have obligations to contractually? That sort of thing. Where else do you do business? So if you've lost some data and you do business in Europe as well, GDPR may be a thing for you. There may be some other things. The Singapore laws are very, very strict. If you're doing business over in Asia, that might be something you need to be aware of if data goes missing from there, or if you're hard down in that environment. Business partners, contracts, your customers. Obviously, all of these things are things that we need to understand, right? Again, it depends. It really depends on your organization and many, many other things. So this is how this typically goes when we're planning for incident response. We go out and we read a lot of things. We ask some questions. We might even have some trusted advisors in and say, what are the best practices for us to best understand how we might respond to an incident? What do we need? And there's a lot of answers out there around, you can go to NIST and I'm going to say that I'm going to call out a few other things in this organization, in this presentation, but everybody gives good information. Everybody is out there giving the best information that they can, trying to make help your organization be better at responding. What I'm saying is still do all of that. Look for all that information, but then as an organization, look at it and figure out what makes the most sense for your organization. So go out there and check those best practices. But generally then what happens is they take those at face value and go, well, that's the best practice. They say we should go out and we should spend $3 million on a sim, and we should keep everything for a year, and we're going to keep all of the things. Or we're going to keep this thing because it says this thing is the most important. And maybe that's firewall logs. Who knows? But we also need to check our budget. Maybe we can't afford a $3 million sim. So, okay, so maybe we only have this much money and maybe we can only do this thing. Okay, well, then we're going to go, okay, well, from that, we're going to go, well, here's the best practices. And we think those are okay. And we've got this much money. And so we're going to go and we're going to collect what is recommended and what we can afford, right? So we're going to figure out how we're going to do that and collect that. And then we're going to keep for, let's say NIST says we're going to need to keep it for a year. So we're going to keep it for a year because that makes sense. We're going to keep it for a year. There's another way that this is done. And this is something that I see really frequently is one, we have no idea what we will need. If our worst nightmare comes true, we have no idea what we're going to need. So we've made no plan for that. When I say, for instance, do your Active Directory logs get sent somewhere centrally? No. Do your firewall logs get sent somewhere centrally? No, they're just on the local appliance. Okay, so that's the default settings. That's the default settings, which means you have no log retention, right? So they're not kept for any length of time. They probably rolled over because they are no longer available. And we're really working on thoughts and prayers at that point. We're hoping the worst doesn't happen. And when it does, we're working on those prayers to hope that we still have a job at the end of it. So I think when we think about this scenario, this is the worst case scenario of the worst case scenario, right? When we get into that worst case scenario, we're having all these people ask us questions about how we're going to respond, how we're going to recover. And we go, well, we're not really sure. And those are when those conversations around, how are we going to actually be a business next week if we don't know the answer to these questions come in. So this is what I'm suggesting. Now, and I will say that this presentation is not around recovery necessarily. I'm not going to answer all the questions. What I'm specifically talking about is what happens when the worst case scenario of your organization happens and you needed to do an investigation or you needed to recover quickly. What are some of the questions that you would need to know right away? So what I'm suggesting is we go back to the bottom. We take that worst case scenario. We start there and we say, here for our organization is the worst case scenario that could happen. And we figure out what that looks like for us. I'm going to go through a few things after this, a few different scenarios, hopefully flesh that out a little bit. But we understand what that worst case scenario might look like. And then we say, when that worst case scenario happens, our objectives in the investigation that follows, in the months or hopefully days or weeks that follow that, our objectives for getting back to business would be this. Finesse those and then figure out from those objectives, what would we need to collect as a business from an investigative perspective, from a recovery perspective, to understand how we might get to where we need to be to answer those objectives. And then how are we going to get there? So the how piece is going to be a little bit around, how do we do those things? How do we collect those things? Where are we going to put them? All those sorts of things, but also around the little bit around budget. But I'm not going to talk really about budget today, but understand that that's a big component in this as well. So again, what kind of organization are you? All of these questions are really going to depend on what organization you are, what are your objectives, what's your industry, what's your vertical, what's your risk profile. All of those things we have to be thinking about. And I'm not going to answer those questions today. I'm just going to hopefully poke you along your way to being able to think about those things with your team and understand maybe what those things you are, and so you can start planning for that. We go through, again, hundreds of investigations a year. And every time that I have to say to a client, I just can't answer this question for you because this thing didn't exist. And I wish that it did, but we can't go back and make it. It is very frustrating for us. It's very frustrating for them. It's frustrating for any folks that they have to notify, for instance, if they have data stolen. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about those things first and working backwards, starting from the bottom, if you will. So I'm going to generalize a lot here and say that there are 3 types of organizations. There's probably many more than this, but I'm going to start with this 3. Data rich. So these are organizations where it doesn't really matter whether things go down as long as the data is safe, as long as the data didn't leave, as long as the data wasn't damaged, and as long as that data is secure and safe, we don't have to worry that the internet is down, that we're down for days at a time, maybe even because that data is safe. We can continue going, and it's okay. Then there's the asset rich, and this is a little bit of a misnomer. But when I say asset rich, what I mean is that for these organizations, as long as their infrastructure is running, as long as everything's continuing to go, that the data on it is maybe transient. It doesn't really matter what that data is, or whether that data is perhaps damaged. As long as the assets are up and running and things are still moving, money's still flowing, products still shipping, that's the most important thing. But then we have that hybrid, which is both of those things are important. We have to have the data. The data is very important. Maybe it's some sort of protected information, but also having those assets up and running is critical to the organization. Obviously, that is really a big generalization, and there's a lot of gray area in there, but we're going to deal with those things today. So let's start with a data-rich organization. And I've chosen something really sort of out there. We've had a lot of supply chain attacks in the last year, year and a half even. So I wanted to choose something that I think was a little germane to that. So data-rich organizations. Let's talk about a software development company. You are a software development company, and your worst case scenario is that a threat actor has gotten in touch with you in some way, and they have threatened the release of the entire source code of your super mega popular software that you get millions and millions of dollars from subscriptions and license sales every year. And if it goes out into public, I mean, your business is finished. Additionally, they've also stolen your customer data, and they're threatening to release that as well. So not only do we have a threat to, what is the core of your business, your source code, but also, there's a lot of brand and reputation issue that's going to go on with regards to customer data possibly being leaked. So I've listed some objectives that we might want to think about. We're going to go to that, and we're going to, this is our worst case scenario. So what would happen if that happened? What objectives would be the most important? And when I think about customers that I speak to on a regular basis, the biggest question, and particularly this is for the lawyers, the biggest question is, what was taken and how much was taken? And a lot of times you get those conversations with, well, the threat actor says they have 1.2 terabytes, but we don't have that much data. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. It really depends on how aware that particular person that you're talking to is of what their estate really looks like. But also, we've known threat actors to be a little fast and loose with the truth as well. So, and they don't always tell you with the proof of life. They may not always send you everything, proof of whatever they've taken. So it's difficult. What have they taken? And that's very, very important for notifications. So how much and what was taken means who do we have to notify? How many people do we have to notify? If it's customer data, for instance, are there any regulators that need to know? All of those things is very important with that question. So that's why that's bolded, because for a company that particularly has had data taken, anything with protected information that's associated with that question is number one, really. And then obviously we get the ones of how did it happen? Are they still in our environment? And the who needs to know. And I talked a little bit about that. Regulators, notifications, all of those things. Customers, who needs to know about what this happened? So from there, if we understand what those objectives look like, we want to understand then, what do we collect? Data exfiltration is one of the most difficult things to prove. And one of the reasons for that is because one of the best ways to prove data exfiltration happened is PCAP. Exactly what has flowed out, packet by packet, what has flowed out of the network is the best way for me as an incident responder to tell you what has left your network. And what I will tell you also as an incident responder of many years is that I have seen PCAP, probably I can count on one hand companies that have had full PCAP for any length of time. It's expensive. It's difficult to store, all of those things. It takes up a lot of room. And so that's a difficult thing. But we can also talk about things like NetFlow, for instance. which is a lot easier. And I'm not going to debate the merits of one thing over another, but network data is the best way for me to tell you what has left your environment. But we've also used great things like, for instance, what file and folders were touched. Process execution. I worked with a company recently who was storing all process execution 4688 events in their Splunk, which was fantastic because what we were able to do is actually go into their Splunk, look at process execution events for the threat actor was using rclone. We were able to see the process execution string. So rclone was executed. We could see what folder that they were attempting to copy out to the file transfer site that they were using. And that was very, very helpful in being able to answer that question of what was taken, not necessarily how much, but the what was taken was much easier to answer when that was placed. So that's something to think about. How would we get that information? What, for instance, events would help us do that? And how would we collect that? So again, more logs, also really important, but sort of in that priority, we're going to start at the network data. And last but not least is how. So how long do we have to have this data? So if we collect the PCAP data, how long should we keep that for? Again, difficult to store because it's huge. And how long do we want to store that data for? Again, it depends on your industry. How long do you need to keep things for, whether it's logs, whether it's PCAP data, or whether it's whatever, are really going to depend on your risk, your vertical, your ability to store that from a budgetary and from a storage perspective. How will we collect it? So that's another thing. If you're a very distributed organization, perhaps collecting that data is going to be a lot more difficult. So we have to understand how we're going to collect it, and then where are we going to store it? Are we going to store it centrally? We're going to store it in the cloud. Are we going to have a managed service provider help us with that? Those are always interesting questions because, for instance, when we're working with managed service providers, and is how do we get that data back if we want to use that for an investigation? And that's something that I've run into a little bit that has been difficult with organizations using managed providers. That data may not be all that easy to look at and to get for an investigation if you need it. And also, how long do we keep it for? How long do we need it? Is there any regulatory or laws that say we have to keep it for a certain amount of time? Is it that year that NIST tells us, or is it less? For our organization, how far do we want to be able to look back? Again, it depends. All right. How about organizations that are data rich? And I chose a manufacturer for this. And by this, I'm saying a manufacturer that manufactures something for someone else. Let's say you go to a manufacturer and I say, I have this, here's my designs. I am the owner of the intellectual property, and I'm just getting them to build that thing for me. So they're somebody that doesn't really care about the data. The data goes missing, not their problem, not their data. All they're doing is they're building stuff. But if they can't build things, if they can't ship out product, then they're losing millions of dollars. So maybe a threat actor brings you hard down with some sort of ransomware, encrypting your systems, and you're no longer able to produce the things, ship product, and you're losing money every day. So your biggest objective isn't necessarily what was taken, because you don't care about the data. It's not your data. You want to get back up and running. But you might also be interested in the other things, like how did it happen? Did they move laterally? What did they do in our environment? Because you want to make sure that it doesn't happen again, obviously, so this sort of thing is happening again. So there are all those objectives we still want to think about, but probably the primary one there is we need to get back up and running as quickly as possible. So from that perspective, your probably what is going to be, what's our most critical assets? What needs to come back up and running? And how do we list that that priority list? What's on our priority list? What needs to come up first? Critical assets might be critical because they need to come up first, or because of the data they hold. So in this case, we're not going to talk about the data, but they want to make sure what's coming up first, and what's that recovery list like? Is what are the dependencies for that? So we need to know things like who owns that process, who owns that server, who owns that appliance. So we can make sure that things come up in the right way, that they're tested, all of those things. We need to understand that what. And again, all of the logs, right? If something was down, if we had a ransomware event, we definitely want some, for instance, authentication logs, understanding, what accounts they were using, How did they move laterally from system to system? Was there, anything used from a process execution perspective? Like, did they use PS exec to move from system to system to help deploy that ransomware, for instance? What other files and folders they touch might be important, might not be. Who knows in this case? Um, but the big hows on this list is probably the how long can we be down before our business is at a critical place that we can no longer recover from. And then again, with that recovery priority list, what should we be recovering first, second, third, fourth? How do we get back to business really, really quickly? But we still want to answer those questions around, for an investigation perspective. How do we understand what our critical assets are? How do we collect that information? And for some organizations, that is very difficult. How do we understand what those recovery priorities are? That again is conversations with stakeholders, business owners, server owners, et cetera, and so forth. For that data, where do we store it? Whether it's logs or whether it's in a critical asset list, where are we going to store it where we can get to it when we need it? That's an interesting one from the perspective of, in an incident and you're hard down, if your list of what your critical assets are, as well as your recovery priority list, is on a system that was encrypted, you're out of luck. You've done all this work and now you can't even use it. And again, with logs and whatnot, how long do we keep it for? And what's important to our industry? Because there may be some things that are germane to a manufacturer vertical that may not be to a software development company. So data-rich organizations, this should be data and asset-rich organizations. I didn't catch that when I was building my slides. So data and asset-rich organizations. And I've chosen a healthcare provider for this one. And we think about that. The data is important, right? Patient data, PHI, really important. That would be our number one thing, right? If data was lost, myself as a consumer of a healthcare provider, I want to make sure my data is safe. But what about if all their systems are hard down? Isn't that more important? If their systems are hard down, they're not able to service their customers, and that might be more critical, right? Might depend on the healthcare provider. So again, the question is, the answer really is, it depends. It depends even within the healthcare vertical, whether data or assets might be more important, but I think they're likely to be at least not necessarily equally important, but there's going to be some balance there. So the objectives are really going to follow back again to all the things we talked about previously. But those two big ones are going to be, if data was taken, what was taken and how much was taken, because that's critical for notifications, not just in Canada, but also into the US and a number of places around the world. Healthcare information, very, very protected. And we want to make notifications if we need to the folks that need to be notified. So that's a huge piece. Those are also really protected by deadlines, right? So the lawyers are very interested in how much was taken, what was taken, because they need to be able to answer those questions within a specific period of time. But also, we need to get back up and running. There is patient care to be done. And so without critical systems, we aren't able to service those customers that are most in need. So we want to make sure that we understand what are our critical assets, how do they get back up, and where do we go from here, right? So there's a balance there, and there may be two work streams in this particular vertical, this particular type of organization that might need to be followed. So that's something to be thinking about when you're considering that worst case scenario. And how do we balance that out, right? So those are the conversations we want to have beforehand, so we can understand what that priority list looks like. So yes, probably losing all that data. If I was going to say a big hospital, for instance, losing all that data, it's going to be really important. It's definitely going to be a work stream, but likely there's going to be people whose voices about patient care are going to be much louder in that conversation. Again, depending on the organization, but a big hospital, that's probably going to be patient care is going to be number one. So that's probably going to win out on that pendulum of what's the most important. So again, I'm going to say this, the cardinal rule of all of this is it depends. Your organization and applying sort of this look at what's your worst case scenario and what your objectives might be in that are going to really depend on so many things that are really very focused on your organization. As an organization at CrowdStrike, from a what's our worst case scenario? We actually, have a few, obviously, but we have a very large, obviously, product environment with a lot of intellectual property. So that would be very, very important for us. But we also are an instant response firm that collects a lot of data from a lot of different companies. So, from a data perspective, that would be very difficult. We also have a managed service. So if our systems went down hard, we would not be able to help our customers. And so we're kind of one of those mixed hybrid organizations, right? We have a few different things that we'd really be thinking about. And what I want you to be thinking about is your organization and what that worst case scenario and what that objectives looks like for you. So we've thought about this. We've gone through, we've decided what our worst case scenario is. We understand what our objectives might be in that situation. We think we know what we're going to collect, how long we need to keep it, how we're going to collect it. And this is kind of where that whole budget conversation comes in, and I'm not going to belabor it really, but the other piece is support. So when we think about, here are the things that we would need in a worst case scenario, you need to have allies to help you push that agenda. And depending on your organization, depending on your vertical, your size, all those things, your allies are going to be different. There's going to be a few similarities, but they are going to be different. So looking at that a little bit, we've got the data rich, for instance. When data goes missing, the first people that care, besides yourself as the security operations person, for instance, is the legal team and usually the privacy officers, right? It sends them into quite a tizzy. And a lot of the times when we talk to security teams, to IT teams who call us for an instant response, one of our first questions is, have you spoken to your internal legal team or have you engaged external counsel? And when the answer is no, that's a little concerning for us. And the reason for that is because in this day and age, any data going missing is going to set off alarm bells for any person with a legal degree. So if you haven't engaged those folks in your organization, legal team, privacy officer, those might be the same people, I highly recommend you're doing that as soon as possible. In fact, in the planning process, include them in this planning process because their worst case scenario might be different from yours. And they may have a good reason for that. And that might be your organization's worst case scenario that you really hadn't thought of. The other people that might be really interested, and this is not an all-encompassing list on any of these, is the data owners. For instance, if you have data going missing, those data owners, one might be your best source of information about what that data was and where it was, but also they're the owners of that information and they're pretty protective of it. So if it goes missing, they're going to be really concerned, or if it's damaged or otherwise, they're going to be really concerned about that and want to be involved in any of that process, which means that if you're looking for support on how to protect that, how to make sure that it is, if it goes out the door, what it was, how it was taken, etc., those three groups particularly are going to be hardcore on your side to help you get what you need to the what and the how. Collect that data, store it, understand what you need, how long you need to keep it. From an asset-rich perspective, again, legal team, they're going to want to know for sure. If you're hard down and you're losing money, the other people on that side is any of the finance folks, and I should have included those, but any finance folks, if you're losing money, that your CFO is going to be on your side for understanding how to best get you guys back up and running as quickly as possible. Asset owners are big for that as well. Anybody on the production or operations side is particularly going to be interested in making sure that we can ship product out. Those sales folks, they're going to be right in your back pocket helping you push this forward, right? They want to make sure that their customers get their orders. So if you're hard down and you can't ship product, those guys aren't getting their bonuses. So, find your allies. If you need help to push your agenda forward, these are the folks you want to talk to. And again, with those asset and data rich organizations, all of the above, particularly in my scenario with the healthcare provider, your legal and your privacy team are going to be your best allies in understanding how to get from D to A, from worst case scenario back to the how, right? Okay, I'm going to recap a little bit here. when we look at situations, a lot of times we look forward, we plan. And I think that's a big thing in incident response. We talk about how we look forward, what's our plan, and how do we understand, if we had an incident, we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. And again, what I'm suggesting is in this scenario is that we look at that worst case scenario first. For your organization, is it something that has to do with data? Is it something that has to do with being down? Is it something in between that? And if it is something in between that, what's your priorities there? Understanding what that worst case scenario looks like for your organization, and then saying, okay, if we had that situation happen, what would be our organization's number one objective in getting to where we needed to be? And then what are the following priorities after that? And I think what's important about that is, from an incident response perspective, my priorities or my objectives generally tend to be investigative. So I'm going to want to know the what, the why, the who, all those things. Not necessarily the why necessarily, but the what and the how and the who we really try to sew up. But from your organization's perspective, that might be important. But getting back up and running, for instance, might be more important. So my priorities might not be your priorities, and it's really important to understand when I come in and I ask some questions. I don't want my priorities to take over what yours should be. I want you guys to have thought about that. I want it to be in your, if I say, hey, what's your objectives? I want you to be able to just state those out for me and make sure that they are reflective of your risk, your organization, your vertical, your obligations. And then we want to make sure that you can meet those objectives. So how do you meet those objectives? From the priority list, we're going to try to meet this one first, obviously, and then go to the second one. Understand what we need from an evidentiary perspective, what we need from a recovery perspective, whether those critical assets, whether that's the priority, et cetera, and so forth. And then how do we make that happen? So here's the thing we found out that we needed, but how do we make that happen? And smaller organizations, that can be more difficult, obviously. We may need external help for that. To help some of those things happen. There may not be budget for everything, which means we need to prioritize what the most important thing is, so we can help find a way to get to the best answer. For larger organizations, that tends to be a little easier question or a little easier answer, and smaller organizations not as much. And then the last thing is, like I said, find your allies. Make sure that you understand who the people, whether they're in your organization or not. Your best friend might be law enforcement, might be an external legal counsel, might be a trusted advisor that you bring in to help find these things and help push this agenda. As a consultant, I know, and I've heard time and time again, that my word saying the same thing as the IT guy that's been there for 15 years has been saying for the last 15 years. Me saying it as an outside consultant somehow carries greater weight with the executive team. Frustrating, but usually true. So if you need that trusted advisor to come in and help you push that agenda, find those allies, legal team, privacy team, make those folks part of your team. Communications folks, I didn't mention those, but those are fantastic as well. And help make that happen. If you do that, you will be able to weather that worst case scenario far better. You'll be able to understand, what that worst case scenario looks like, how we're going to get to a place of recovery, how we're going to get to a place of resolution that much better, and hopefully then be able to handle the less than worst case scenarios with that same plan headed forward. All right. I want to say thank you to the B-Sides Vancouver folks for letting me speak today. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the folks that showed up to listen. I forgot to put my contact information on my slide deck. I realized you can reach me on Twitter at Nerdiosity, or my LinkedIn is Shelly Giesbrecht on LinkedIn. So please feel free to reach out. This is the obligatory photo of my dogs. That's Ruby and that's Annie. And I thank you all for being here today. I appreciate the time. And I'm not sure if there's a way to answer questions, but if there is, I absolutely am willing to do so. I'm looking through the questions and see what I can answer. Okay, so there was a question that was assuming we don't have any way for SSL intercept or decryption. Is PCAP still valuable to have if it's just source destination information? I would say it depends. Again, with the source destination information, you might be better with NetFlow, less volume, and still be able to see NetFlow. I love. I'm a big fan of. Because you've got your source and destination information as well as your byte sent received, which is going to be pretty much as good as that encrypted PCAP if you're not able to decrypt that, and at least give you an idea of what the connections were and how much data has been sent. And if that's what you're dealing with, I would kind of recommend NetFlow over PCAP. But certainly, there's always value in PCAP, depending if you're able to have that decryption point. And let's see. Wondering how many new exploits were also generated from the 30 gigs of MS code supposedly leaked by Lapsus. I honestly have no idea. I think it's going to be interesting to see going forward as well how much we see. And I mean, unfortunately, there always seems to be a new 0 day coming out, whether it's Microsoft source code or otherwise. Here's my patch often, patch frequently, patch every day recommendation. Last one was curious what would be recommended free or affordable selection that allows for collection of NetFlow and PCAP for a small business. Good question. There's a few. I would really start with the what am I trying to think of at the top of my head? There is a distribution, a Linux distribution that has a whole bunch of different things in it, and for whatever reason, it's eluding me right now. But there's a free version of. I'm just losing my mind right now. I will post it on my blog. It's www.nerdiacity.com. When my brain recovers, and for some reason I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. There's a great free distribution you can set up that will help collect NetFlow and you can do some PCAP data as well. I'm thinking it's gone from my head. I don't know why. But there are some options out there. I will Malcolm. Me that there's probably a few out there. That might be one of them. But yes, I don't know why my brain's not functioning today. Security Onion. Thank you, Gabriel. Security Onion was what I was thinking about this. So there's a few. The Security Onion has a few tools kind of mixed into it that you're able to set up and do some capture. Has a few other tools on there as well. And it is very, very helpful and free. And there's a lot of resources out there that you can use to, sort of set that up, and you can put it in a VM and do some collection there. It's what I have used at my house for a number of years, and until I started doing a little bit more, but. Awesome. Any additional questions? Oh, and Tyler said Security Onion as well. Eric said Suricata. Yes, there's a few different. Security Onion has Suricata on it. So absolutely, those are great answers. Thank you guys so much for that. I don't know why my brain wasn't working, but appreciate everyone's time today. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of the day. Enjoy the rest of B-Sides. And again, thank you to B-Sides for having me.